Welcome to Placecast, a local policy innovation partnership hub production based at the University of Birmingham. Placecast is essential listening for those keen to explore the ins and outs of knowledge mobilisation for influence in central and local government, based on the view that it is only through animating the power of place-based leadership that the wicked problems of 2025 can become more manageable. Whether you're a researcher, citizen scientist, an activist, a professional working in the public sector, civil servant, politician, analyst, or entrepreneur, we think that it's through our networks that most solutions can be assembled, tested, and the learning shared before we go again, and that universities can act as the repositories and observatories of these efforts. We're based in City-REDI and rooted in the LPIP programme funded by the ESRC, AHRC, and Innovate UK. This podcast aims to highlight knowledge and evidence-based ways of working and the strategies needed to shape real impact on the decisions that shape our society. Our guests are change makers from across the UK, with stories about the ways in which influence can be achieved. We focus in particular on some of the connective tissue within and between sectors for clues as to how to animate place-based leadership, as innovating is a team sport best done in the open. Please contact us with feedback on the episodes, or if you'd like to be a guest, or have strong views on the processes of advocacy, lobbying, public campaigning and more, unpacking how research and evidence connects with neighbourhood, local, city, regional and national missions. I'm here this morning with the great Mark Swift. Mark Swift's been known to me for certainly more than a decade. He's a social entrepreneur with more than 15 years' experience in health and care sector. His specialist interest is in community-centred health approaches, improving patient outcomes and reducing demand on public services. Mark is a passionate advocate of the voluntary community and social enterprise sector and the role it could play in transforming health and care services. Hi, Mark.
Oh, hi, Nicola. Thanks very much for inviting me here.
Always a pleasure to talk. I think the first time we met, what did I say to you?
You asked me if I was from the future because you were fascinated by the work we were doing, and you very kindly come and spent an afternoon with us looking at our work and whatnot. So that was my first introduction to network, Nicola. And if I remember correctly, you did some network analysis for us to show how the work we were doing was building new types of collaborations and networks that would allow knowledge and information to flow better. So, yeah.
So, yes, are you from the future? And I think still, actually, 15 years on, you are still definitely right at the cutting edge. And that's a hard thing to achieve over such a long period of time. So well done you. So in general, you're most associated with this preventative and kind of holistic healthcare agenda based in your work at Wellbeing Enterprises, which is Liverpool and Northwest based, isn't it? Can you tell me how you became engaged in that work?
Yeah, of course. So I originally started out working in the NHS. I was a public health improvement specialist in the NHS for a number of years, then switched into commissioning and I led on clinical quality. During my time as a public health improvement specialist, I was afforded the opportunity to spend time with communities. And, you'll hear often in the language rhetoric around disadvantaged communities, hardship, deficits, negatives. But I was also always blown away by the resourcefulness and ingenuity of people, even in the most challenging and adverse conditions. And I felt that we were just missing a trick sometimes in not spending more time understanding what the strengths and capabilities of people and communities are and mapping those resources to help us achieve better health and wellbeing outcomes. And so I was fired up by some of those insights. I'd also had some lived experience. In my early 20s, I'd gone through a period of depression and anxiety, having been assaulted. I also have experienced the benefit of community-based support through self-help provision and the voluntary sector to support my own recovery. So bringing both my lived experience and my insights through my work, I just thought there's an opportunity here to sort of join the dots and rethink the way we mobilize community energy and citizen power to bring about better outcomes. And so at the time, if I'm not mistaken, Gordon Brown launched the CIC as a format, a new way of making it easier for people to set up community businesses. And I thought, well, why couldn't I create a community business that is very much centered around the grassroots and looks at mobilising people's skills and talents to improve health outcomes. And that really was the beginning of my journey, really, my learning journey. And of course, at the beginning, rather naively, I thought we were going to come in and, within a couple of weeks, we'd get a handle on inequalities in our community and we'd go and we'd solve the problem really quickly. But actually, what I realised now with hindsight, looking back 20 years, what it really has allowed me is the space to learn deeply and understand deeply the problems, the challenges, the issues, and to work with that complexity to develop ways of working that respond more effectively. And of course, we've been collecting data and evidence of that over the time. So I suppose I've come from both perspectives, if you like, both from a lived experience perspective and also working in the public sector as well. That rounded experience has been really, really helpful to me in my own social entrepreneur journey.
Very interesting. And I was just saying to someone the other day, like, institutional design, you create brittle things which might fit but might be shallow. Whereas what you're describing, that the genuineness of place-based, that is inevitably, it's deep and it's profound. And as you say, it can be long-term. And I think if we're going to have any hope, actually, of staying on the right side of sort of agendas like this, you need to combine the institutional fix, which might be shallow, with the knowledge and understanding, which, as you say, is incredibly deep, really profound. So that's what gives me hope about your work. I feel like it, because you are so well networked in with sort of institutional change, but it comes from that depth and that you're really in the soil of your communities. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting reflection. Thank you. It's okay not to know. It's okay not to know the answers right now, but to commit to learning through doing and to be reflexive in that process. And for me, spending time with communities to really understand what it means to live a good life and what are the personal and structural barriers that stand in the way of people being able to achieve that. And then importantly, going into that sort of co-design and creative process where we explore what those potential solutions and avenues are. And I think that's what I enjoy the most about what I do. That idea of being a social entrepreneur is about learning through doing and also being ethical and moral both in what you do and how you go about doing it. So the means and the ends, must be aligned. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this experience. But who I am as a person and my responses and my understanding have evolved as I have learned along the way and as I've been reflexive in that process. So it's a continuing journey. And that's the joy really of being a social entrepreneur, that, as you learn and go deeper, you find other avenues to explore and other structures and systems at play that are things we need to look at and consider as well. So I feel incredibly fortunate to be in a position as I am. I think it's probably fair to say that I'm somebody who's learned to orbit the system. And by that, what I mean is actually being able to innovate on the boundaries. So creating safe space, psychologically safe space where we can test and try things, where we can convene different actors and celebrate diversity and imagine and dream a little before we think. And then as we shape up our understanding and our responses, it's then how do we bring that back to the center and the core? So orbiting and then bringing that back to the center. Of course, some of the work we've delivered around social prescribing is a good example of that, where we've been able to develop these innovations on the fringe of the system and then bring them back into the mainstream.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Now, so everything that you've said seems to suggest a strong kind of elision with the objectives of the LPIP programme. Can you say something about how you found the LPIP, or was it through your work with the Heseltine Institute?
Yes, it was. Yeah. So obviously I'm a visiting fellow at the Heseltine Institute as well. And I became aware of the opportunity at LPIP. When I read the brief, it just sung to me, Nicola, this idea of mobilising knowledge and insight cross-sectorially from people from different backgrounds, and the desire to want to work with complexity, understand how we can respond in a place-based way, spoke deeply to me, both in terms of my practice and my own lived experience as well. So I just had to be a part of it. So I threw my hat in, and I was very, very fortunate to secure a place here. And I'm bowled over, actually, by the energy for change within the network that's emerged amongst other place fellows and colleagues at LPIP at the University of Birmingham. I think there's a real centre of gravity here around wanting to provocate, challenge the system, and offer some interesting ideas and concepts back. Because for me, we've got to move beyond the rhetoric. Everywhere we go, I hear people waxing lyrical about system working and prevention first. But it's in our actions that we'll be able to demonstrate that. And for me, it's about getting things done. And I feel very much at home in a space where I'm being encouraged to explore and dream a little and then get on with the actual doing and learning as part of that process. So yeah, it's a joy.
And you do strike me, I'm very interested, I'm always fascinated by people's kind of careers inside and outside, leading from within, leading from the margins, as you said, orbiting systems, because not least because that puts quite a lot of pressure on yourself and on your network to stay. If you were, for example, a deputy chief exec of a big health trust, or chief exec, let's say, if you're a leader, then the system, it does support you when things get tough. I mean, it can constrain you and all the rest of it as well. But I wonder where we can draw our strength from as innovators, as intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs through systems. And I always find you very inspiring to chat with, because I think the fact that it's a values-driven mission for you, the fact that it's personal and the fact that it's rooted in your community, we do get a little bit embarrassed, particularly maybe in scholarly circles, talking about like a public service ethic, a public service ethos, partly because, we're sort of partly in and out of being public servants, you know what I mean? Like, so as you've described, you're like a honeybee, you're kind of buzzing around. And I think my experience of the LPIP has just been loads of fellow travellers, some of whom have done the work, fallen over, got back up, fallen over, got back up. And it does feel genuinely supportive and values driven. And that's exactly the space that I kind of find so interesting, which is why, of course, we find these routes for non-traditional communication, because we want, the idea of just somebody listening to our conversation in their earbuds on a walk for their mental health. I mean, that just feels, that's exactly right, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's not easy being a social entrepreneur. There's always a risk, isn't it? You go on LinkedIn, you see the shiny veneers of everybody's professional careers. And the reality is that being a social entrepreneur means that you are challenging and provocating a system, which can be incredibly tough at times because you are going against the grain. So it is really, really important that, social entrepreneur resilience is a key thing. Having your own support structures and psychological safety in place is critical. And that's why I think things like LPIP are absolutely vital, because they provide that sort of cover and space where you can connect with others, convene with other people who share similar ideas or radically diverse views. And in that melting pot, the sparks and scintillations of our ideas and discussions, that we can dream things up. It is both the joy and the challenge of what I do. And, I reflect back on 20 years of my work, and I've had many, many failures. I always say that what they are is that they point towards a direction. They're an insight. They're learning. And obviously, if we accept that gift and we continue to learn through doing reflexively, we can continue to grow. It's a challenge. It's a challenge sometimes being on the outside. And of course, I won't pretend to you that it is often the case that the system can other people like me. We can be held at distance from the centre of power and decision making as well. It's not easy, but, it's important that social entrepreneurs and people who think differently and who approach problems from different perspectives do have a seat around the table. And so from my perspective, I suppose the way I view my work is that we're very much rooted in the grassroots from the ground up. And so the approach we tend to take is, well, what can we learn through collaborating with diverse stakeholders and citizens? What can we build and create? And then from those learnings, how do we then communicate that back through policy briefs, presentations, programs of learning, so that we almost reverse engineer policy making from the ground up? And that's what really, really excites me. And, I reflect on the successes we've had. We've achieved some extraordinary outcomes for individuals. I'm not under the illusion that everything is perfect, because, of course, we're building those outcomes on a system architecture that is fundamentally flawed. And so as I look at the future of my career, the next 10 years, I'm very, very interested in the way that social entrepreneurs and social enterprises like mine can contribute, not only in terms of experimenting and innovating, but also being a champion of the reconfiguration and restructuring of our system architecture. Because the truth is, if we want system change, then the core prerequisites of that are relational. They're about building trust, solidarity, goodwill, sharing. And they are outcomes of feeling you were a part of a system where you were heard, understood, and respected. And therefore, we've got to look at how we build systems that feel more deliberative, more participatory and inclusive. How do we ensure citizens are not just the recipients of our services, but are the co-creators and are driving the direction? Perhaps our role is to be the first follower rather than the leader and let the community take the way forward. So I'm very excited as I look to the future. There's challenge and there's opportunity in how I may redefine my role and have been over the last few years to support some of that systems work. I'm an optimistic kind of chap, but I choose that because I haven't really found many situations where something positive comes from the deficit and the negative. It's not to delude myself that everything is shiny and perfect. On the contrary, I am a pragmatic and I see the problems every day, but I choose to approach those problems from a glass half full perspective. And for me, that's about effectual logic. It's about looking at the resources at our disposal, our capabilities and strengths. How do we build networks that support change? And that's something I personally enjoy. So although it's an incredibly challenging time, I think it's very important that I don't get drunk on the fatalism that plays out in narratives today and instead choose a different path, one where I remain hopeful and optimistic that by collaborating, convening and building the right system architecture, we can deliver the change that is absolutely necessary and the change that people want and need to live a good life.
Brilliant. Okay, you can be Prime Minister. I mean, Chief Secretary of the whatever they've called it. It does feel to me like the few years that I spent working in Liverpool, the soil of Liverpool is quite fecund with social entrepreneurships, quite, all the kind of work of Blackburn House and Claire Dove and others, it feels like a model which is of a place and is of your place and that works effectively. But I do wonder the privilege almost of not being sort of drowned by the dead hand of the centre gives you a bit more scope in the kind of Liverpool context, the Northwest context. I know that you work nationally, but it feels quite of your place and time, the way that you're describing your work. So if everybody else has now cottoned on to the power of place, could you maybe speak to me a little bit about the potential for your work reaching maturity and becoming fully embedded? What does that look like to you, Mark?
Well, in relation to our public sector services, I think there's the bigger goal here around how we essentially re-socialise our public services. I look at our health and care system and the paradox and quandary around prevention. So, for example, the 10-year plans come out, and of course, it's very hard to disagree with the content of that plan. Prevention first makes absolute sense. But the reality is that where do we find the money to do that when so much of the money, about 95% of the entire NHS budget, is being consumed by people who got ill that could have been prevented in the first place? So for me, we need to look at that sort of shift towards prevention. And I think that involves reaching out to the social circumstances of people's lives. So the power of community, place building. Here in the Liverpool City region, one of our greatest strengths is the diversity of our voluntary community and social enterprise sector. And I put the challenge back to our public sector leaders in local authority and NHS and say, it's important that we are brought into the centre and discussions about how we bring change about. We need to be convened. We need to be recruited and put to work. And there are enormous opportunities there to look at how we mobilise community-based interventions, things like social prescribing, although it's not a panacea, is an example of where we can reconnect with people's social circumstances. What's going on in a person's life is critical. And, how do we address those personal and structural barriers that stand in the way of people achieving their key objectives? We have challenges here in our region around economic productivity. That a large portion of people are out of work because of common mental health problems. The mental health problem is the symptom of a bigger issue. It's about peeling the layers back and saying, well, how do we build communities where people feel that they can be heard, understood, they can develop their skills and strengths, feel supported, grow and secure opportunities? So for me, it's about how we build the system architecture to enable people to fulfill their potential. And I think I always talk about re-socialising our public services as a critical first step in some of that.
I couldn't agree more. And so I find myself quite often, as you know, my work tends towards sort of social economy and urban economic concerns. And I do get itchy when you hear people talking about economies in a way that doesn't feel like pro-human, or how we've ended up in such an odd place where almost sort of spreadsheets and budgets and all of that. And you mentioned the word enabling so often, and it's been really inspiring to me to look at, as you say, the mental health epidemic, an epidemic of poor mental health. You aren't truly disabled by a mental health issue. You're disabled by a system that can't then put you to work in an effective way, working through it. So, a lot of work around ableism, the notion that your person is a emotionally and mentally healthy cis-het man, it's just nonsense, right? We know full well that we need to find meaningful economic activity for people that are in all those bits of the kind of intersectional pie. And the system mustn't be looking to exclude and to push out and to other and all those things. A truly inclusive economy is using the talents of those people, not because it's nice, not because it's kind, because it's better. I feel really strongly about that. Sorry, I'm a bit of a rant about that.
Absolutely. Life is a challenge, and we will all go through the challenges of life. And many of us will experience common mental health difficulties. But, we have to build our economy towards the reality of people's lived experiences. And we have to have the safety nets and support structures in place so that people can contribute no matter where they are in their life, no matter what challenges they face. And that, for me, is the sign of a mature, inclusive economy as I see it and as I understand it. But so often, so many people end up disenfranchised, othered, cast aside, and left without the opportunity to grow and develop their potential. I think that's a real missed opportunity, not just here in our region, but further afield. But I am so optimistic and hopeful by the work here in our Liverpool City region and the efforts of cross-sector partners, our public sector colleagues, voluntary community, social enterprise sector organisations working collaboratively is absolutely critical to shift the dial on this. And, you mentioned earlier that being a social entrepreneur does actually gift us more space and opportunity to actually think more, dare I say, more creatively and entrepreneurially. Although I have met the most extraordinary entrepreneurs in the public sector as well. But, no matter where we're coming at this, if we are serious about system change and system working, we have to learn to recognise that ultimately we all want the same thing. We all want to see a prosperous, thriving community where people are supported through all the stages of their lives. And I think for me, it's finding that common ground and shared purpose where I think we can really start to synergize our efforts. And I think sometimes what we see often are very well-intentioned sectors and professionals grappling with profoundly complex challenges in isolation from others and from people who think widely different to ourselves. But that challenge is actually a critical success factor in building the environment for innovation and change. It's only when we're challenged and we're invited to see the world differently that we can really start to reimagine what might become and otherwise be. I think one of the things I'm keen to champion in our region is more convening spaces where people can collaborate across sectors and with citizens and communities and around a common shared mission around enabling everybody to fulfill their potential and live a good life. It's only by coming together and building solidarity that we will drive the system change that's necessary.
So in this vein then, could we just have a moment to have a spotlight on solutions? So can you describe something that you've worked on that really worked well in this space?
We've done a lot of really interesting work using dream-based methods, particularly Ruth Levitis's method around utopia as method, to invite communities and stakeholders to explore alternate futures and possibilities. And often we become so constrained by the challenges of the here and now that we don't allow ourselves the possibility to reimagine what might become and otherwise be. So we often do these exercises where we put on, they kind of joke, like we put on our wow glasses and we imagine that we could see the future. In fact, I'm going to model these for you now. I know you can see these. So these are really snazzy looking glasses.
Because this is not a visual medium, I have to tell you, listener, that Mark has now got pink, star-shaped, amazing sunglasses on. His sort of rose-tinted glasses that he's just put on.
Absolutely. And, these are standard issue. And Nicola, there'll be a pair in the post for you, most certainly. Yeah, I jest and I joke, but this idea that obviously we need to recognise the challenges of the here and the now. We cannot delude ourselves that they're not there. So we register those challenges of the here and now, but then we set them aside and then we allow ourselves the space to use our imagination for what it is intended, which is to problem solve, to imagine new futures and new possibilities, new scenarios. And we've done the most energizing and joyful work with communities and stakeholders where we visioned out using community artists, people's aspirations for better services, more prosperous communities. And when we have that vision, the idea is that we track back from that vision, we backcast. What would have to change to make that vision become our reality and essentially reverse engineer our action plans and mobilize the energy for change to our disposal and the resources at our disposal to realize those objectives. Now, of course, just because we dream doesn't mean it'll happen. But I think it's fair to say that those who dream rarely achieve the dream as they intend, but do better than if they'd never dreamed at all. And there's something about focusing on shared goals and missions that I think is absolutely critical. So we've done some really interesting work in that space, which has been fantastic, looking at service redesign. We did some work looking at children with behavioural challenges, looking at redesigning services. We did some lovely work with citizens where we gifted money, small grants, try it, do it, build it, from £500 up to £5,000 for people who have ideas for social change. And we ended up funding 66 community businesses across our area, from street cleaning, environmental activists, to motivational speakers, to people creating pop-up cafes for people with food intolerances and allergies. And there's so much latent potential out there, Nicola. There's so much energy for change that we're not harvesting that needs to be brought around the table. But as well as that, also let's create our own table where we can grow that from the bottom up. So some really exciting work. We did some work around citizen asset mapping. So we developed some digital technology that put the power in the hands of community to map places in their area that help them achieve well-being. So rather than having joint strategic assets assessments being written by public sector professionals, actually we put the power in the hands of citizens. And what is the value of a park bench for building social connectedness? The value of our parks and green spaces. Working with communities, we're able to unpack that. Through that, actually develop plans through which we could support and regenerate and develop areas and mobilise resources and spaces in communities that help people to stay well. So there's lots of really interesting things that we've set about doing that have been very much focused from the ground up, not seeing citizens as passive recipients or as problems, but actually understanding people as people with strengths and lived experience and values and passions. And of course, it's a core value of my organisation that we hold dear the belief that everybody has strengths and capabilities that are of value to society. And we believe in the power of people to make change possible. And I think for me, it's how then do we join the dots between these grassroots efforts, much of which is also being shaped and supported by our social entrepreneurs, with the efforts of our public sector colleagues. How do we join those things together to solidify and to synergize those efforts? I think that's critical, having a pincer approach, both ground up and top down.
We're just moving. I was thinking about international lessons, but you've prompted me in this question to maybe think through how you align the evidence base of what works to make system change happen. And you were very helpful to give me a whole list of things. So we had surround yourself with radically different people, build networks that are diverse and inclusive, see citizens as a solution, put the learning first, dream a little before you think, and understand that structure and function are related, and then what we do is relational. So that's really helpful. And I say I'll put links in the notes to work that you've done on these things. And what has that led you to next? What are you working on next?
So I started writing at the end of last year, writing up some of the work around dream-based approaches and methods. And I'm really passionate about imagination as a concept. So I wrote a few pieces, and I've been inspired by the work of the likes of Jeff Morgan. Mm-hmm. He wrote a beautiful book, Another World is Possible. I've mentioned already Ruth Levitis's work, Utopia as Method. I see imagination as infrastructure, as important as the pipes we lay in communities and the wires that bring electricity to our home. I think there's a key task here around rescuing our imagination from fatalistic narratives that are playing out today. And how do we use and reconnect with our imagination for what it was intended, not to catastrophize and worry, but to be creative and to problem solve and to dream new futures and new possibilities in much the same way that an entrepreneur looks at the resources in front of them and reimagines new propositions and artifacts in the world. I started writing a couple of blogs which have been really well received. And reading Jeff Morgan's work, he talks about creating spaces called imaginariums, which are essentially adaptive spaces, spaces where people can convene, cross-sectorially, citizens, so on and so forth, to come together to dream a little. So we have set out to mark our 20th birthday. We are launching what we believe is one of the first imaginariums, the Liverpool City Region Imaginarium. And this is basically a space that will unlock civic imagination for social change. Because I believe that imagination is a civic superpower that we're not fully harvesting and harnessing right now. So what will be in the Imaginarium? Well, we're going to have imagination labs, spaces where people can come, communities will set topics. Maybe they're concerned about issues of unemployment or poverty. Maybe they want to look at climate change. Maybe they want to focus on making a prosperous area. So together we'll convene people from a wide array of backgrounds to come and undertake this dream-based and future scenario type work where we'll imagine what that future might look like. And then running parallel to that, we'll have system sandboxes, spaces where those dreams go to be built. Maybe we're experimenting with new campaigns, developing technologies, new services, different ways of responding, a safe space where we can test and try new ideas. Alongside opportunities for citizens and change makers to have fellowships through the Imaginarium, a repository of ideas that we share open source, citizen-led policy briefs and vlogs and ideas. And it just really is a space of hope and optimism, a space where we can create our own centre of gravity to distort some of the more traditional power structures that drive often how we approach some of the more challenging inequalities and complex problems in society. Because I absolutely believe that although we must fight for a seat around the table in terms of decision making, it's also critically important that we create our own table as well, where communities and those who often are on the fringes and margins of a system can come together and feel supported and to build solidarity and collaboration. So this is something we're committing to, we're investing in, we've got skin in the game. And we've put a call out for anyone and everyone to come and be a part of this. And we've been absolutely blown over, Nicola, by the positivity and goodwill in our communities. Here in the Liverpool City region, we have so many things to be hopeful and optimistic for, not least the goodwill and the energy for change that permeates our communities. I want to see to it over the next chapter of my career that I help to co-create a space where learning takes centre stage and where we can dream a little before we think. So I'm really fired up about this learning journey. I think there's two things I'm particularly interested in. The first is what happens when you convene people who are radically different and you start to build that centre of gravity for change. And then I'm also intrigued around the governance arrangements that will sit behind this. You'll note earlier in the talk, I talked about the importance of walking the walk and being ethical and social, both in our means and in our ends. So I am particularly keen to explore what kind of deliberative and participatory governance structures can exist that actually ensure that citizens and communities lead this work and lead its direction of travel, so that people like me and others can become the first followers of that agenda. So it promises to be an extraordinary learning journey. I'm so excited to explore what will come about from it. So that's something we're really excited about. And other than that, also continuing with the community-centred work we do at Wellbeing Enterprises, looking at opportunities to respond differently to the symptoms that present in our communities that hold people back, by getting to their root issues and their root challenges. And again, that is very much a place-based endeavour, mobilising assets and resources as well.
Change the conversation. I think I was suffering from 20th century thoughts when I asked, what's a good broker and what's a good place leader? And you have quite rightly asked me to think again about what constitutes, what would that first follower through the Imaginarium, what qualities and what kind of mindset do you think can fuel really good brokerage, by which I mean, that sort of scholarship in a sense, and place leadership kind of in this world that you describe? What are the features of really good brokerage and leadership in the Imaginarium kind of scenario?
Do you know, it's such an interesting time, Nicola, to be alive now when so many challenges are playing out. Complex societal problems, wicked problems around climate change, inequality. The world feels to some extent less secure than it's ever felt. But yet also we have extraordinary insights and wisdom and knowledge and technology that can support us through these challenges. And when I reflect on leadership today, I think the leader of today is radically different, or the qualities of that leadership really ought to be radically different to what we've seen before. Long gone are the linear cause and effect paradigms, this idea that we can simply fix things and put fixes on things and expect the world to work that way. The world isn't linear. It's a profoundly complex structure with so many different competing factors. So I think when I think about leadership, I think about the duality of leadership. What I mean is that to be a good leader, for example, in the public sector today, there's no question that you have to be an institutional leader in the sense that you must achieve your statutory objectives. You must balance the books. You must make sure what you do is safe and effective and delivers outcomes. And nobody would dispute that. I think that's a critical, fundamental core skill. But I think there's another duty and responsibility that sits beyond that, which is our responsibility to our system as a whole. And so for me, this other dimension is about system stewardship, which is saying, well, I am the chief executive of a public sector organisation. I have responsibilities to my citizens and my statutory duties, but I also have a responsibility to the system as a whole. So what role can I play to build the system architecture, to collaborate across sectors, to convene and bring those who support our agenda together, to nurture the system, and to build participatory and inclusive governance structures and collaborations so that we can really get to grips with these profoundly complex problems? Because my organisation would not be big in itself to do that. The NHS is not big enough in and of itself to solve inequalities. Neither is local authority. It's going to have to be a team effort. And as you said, innovation is a team sport. So I think the requirements of leadership today are that duality. So being a good institutional leader, but also understanding our system stewardship responsibilities and being able to walk the walk. So making sure that as we adhere to our institutional responsibilities, we don't systematically undermine our work in the system. We have to be ethical and moral both in our means and in our ends. I think there's the challenge there. I think our leaders will need support to build the skills and competencies, and dare I say the skill sets and mindsets to be able to think across those two different perspectives or lenses of leadership. But I think within that is an extraordinary opportunity to leave a lasting legacy, not just in terms of your institution, but being an architect of system change. Because I am concerned that we're in a rush to get on to do the business and doings before we build the foundations for trust and reciprocity and goodwill. And time again, I see, for example, representatives picked out of fresh air to represent a sector or and the question is, where was the due diligence? What is the governance? How do we know that that's being done properly? For me, we mustn't let our public sector leaders off the hook around that. It's vitally important that if we espouse the rhetoric of system change, that we are willing to roll up our sleeves and do the hard work, building a system that enables the goodwill, trust and reciprocity that are prerequisites for solidarity and collaboration and innovation. And if we don't do that, we'll be building our outcomes on foundations that will be rocky and unstable.
Talking to you, I spent a couple of hours trying to write a response to the sort of problems that the government have found themselves in this first year. And I think that they could learn an awful, like formal politicians or people with a democratic accountability to Parliament could do themselves an awful lot of favours by listening to what you say. Because I think that part of the reason why the government doesn't feel like it's kind of heading in the right direction is that they feel to me like it's all, they're technocrats, and the sort of big hopey changey thing, as Obama got characterized as, how's the hopey changey thing going? Without that, then you really can't get your ducks to line up. Your ducks fly off and kind of find other people. You know what I mean? I think that it's really profound, this moment, a year into a supposedly reforming government, which appears to have lost a bit of its appetite for kind of what it's there to do. And that's immediately what if they could work in the way that you describe, and then that could flow from the centre. Think how different it would feel. It feels to me like the centre is where ideas go to die at the moment.
Yeah, and it's frustrating, isn't it? Because if we get the foundations right, then we set ourselves up for success longer term. And instead what ends up happening, if, for example, you look at the social value agenda, that held so much promise in terms of bringing value, economic, social, environmental well-being to the core of what we do. But instead, it's been othered and siloed as a monetized widget, dial and bean counting exercise separate to the core of what we do. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's great examples of good practice around the country, but generally speaking, things end up monetized, dialed up in KPIs. But what if rather than having KPIs, we had key possibility indicators where we were interested in, learning and growth and collaboration? It's a radically different way of thinking. But I think it's absolutely necessary. We've got to build the foundations to enable the players of the system to collaborate effectively.
And I am hugely encouraged by what you say, because if this thinking can become the DNA of the Liverpool City region, as I said, there's a lot of, you're standing on the shoulders of giants. There's a lot of people that have gone before in that context. And if Steve particularly is able to become kind of enlivened by this kind of potentiality rather than the kind of doom kind of agenda, that potentially the subnational then, so your subnational story, can become a much more hopeful and positive set of narratives. I have worried, of course, that the mayoral agendas and the sort of city regional agendas, they need to feel like spaces of hope and opportunity rather than sort of this little dead hand slightly. And I feel like in the absence of proof about how to walk these walks and how to, you end up with sort of somehow this kind of inertia creeps in that sort of can feel so dispiriting to people.
Yes, and the fatalism, the sense that we can't move forward. And this is infiltrating the mindsets of our children, the next generation. This is a real problem. This is a hearts and minds endeavour, and we must rescue our imagination. We must be able to create the space. It is not delusional to be hopeful. There is a lot to be hopeful for. But if we flirt too long with fatalism, it sucks our life energy away. It limits the possibilities and the things we can think about. I am a hopeful optimist, and unapologetically so, but I'm also under no illusion that this is a long game. As I said, when I first became a social entrepreneur, I kind of rather naively thought I'd be moving on to another big problem within 12 months, solving the last one. But it doesn't work like that. The learning is continuous. It'll be a continuous process of adapt and change and grow. But that's the joy of being a human, isn't it? Being alive is the joy of discovering and learning deeply. And I think if we can create the spaces and the system architecture where those kinds of things are front and center, that we pre-configure learning before we set the outcomes. We'll avoid hitting the target and missing the point. And that, unfortunately, is where we're at right now. So, and that requires also an ability to hold a mirror up to ourselves, all of us, whether you're a social
It's
entrepreneur or a
hard what you're
system.
describing, this sort of integrity, but also openness. It's hard to wear. I think radical hope as a kind of foundation for public sector value and challenging kind of deep entrenched inequality. I'm drawn to it, but equally my fear is that it asks too much of people who have come up in a system where if they just meet their targets, or if they just balance the budget, or if they just, then they'll be safe, psychologically safe. And I think what you're describing, it's radical hope quite profoundly. It's, when I used to do work on community planning, community power in sort of urban settings, if you are doing community power properly, then everyone changes as a result, not just those that came and said, right, you're changing and you're changing. And that can be an uncomfortable space to be in, because it's not that I think at the moment the system tries to fit people into it for better or worse. And then if that doesn't work, then they say, oh, well, it's sort of almost you fall off the bottom. But if everyone is in this process of hope and change and this kind of imminence and this becoming, everyone is a bit more unsettled than they started. And that is both a real positive, but it does involve an element of a kind of, there's a certain magic to it that you have to believe that you'll get through the tough bits together. I think that's missing currently.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting perspective. Listen, the reality is, whether you're a social entrepreneur or a public sector professional, what we're setting out to do is profoundly complex and challenging. And I have great admiration for our public sector professionals who are working in extraordinarily challenging times, trying valiantly to deliver that change. And I also understand there are constraints. There are constraints that also lock people in to ways of acting. But I suppose, in a way, I'm not necessarily asking that people shift the dial on that in 24 hours. I suppose what I'm saying is, what are the gifts we have? The gifts of head, hearts, and hands. What can we influence within our sphere that will enable us to point in the general direction of the dream we desire? Now, we may not achieve the dream, but we get closer than if we didn't dream at all. And so I'll give you a practical example. So in an area where I worked, we developed a social prescribing program. And initially there was an almost reflex action to come running at me with at least 20 different KPIs on a sheet before we'd even explored what this service was. And I had, I'll be honest with you, what I call an allergic reaction to it. I was like, what on earth is this? How can we measure now when we don't know what people want and need? And that was very challenging for the individuals who were pushing these KPIs, because that's what we do. And so can we find a middle ground? Can we work together? Because I understand the desire to want to measure outcomes and evidence impact for public money. But I wonder if we can develop some broad thematic themes to operate within, to set safe boundaries while we go on this exploratory learning phase with our communities. And then when we've done that work, we can revisit KPIs and check whether they actually align with what communities want and need. And actually, it was a really fascinating conversation where we met each other in the middle. We understood each other's perspectives and needs and desires, and actually found that middle ground, walked that middle ground. And by doing that work, we all learnt in the process that actually it's absolutely critical that we learn first what people want and desire and what they need before we set out to put the dials and widgets on it. And I'm thinking in our everyday work, what is in our sphere of influence that we can do that might nudge the system in that little direction, whether it's forming a new network, maybe it's talking to community leaders, maybe it's inviting social entrepreneurs into your team meeting. Those little nudges begin the process of opening up the system and flowing knowledge. And again, it's the flow of knowledge that allows us to be able to innovate and adapt it through time. So I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm kind of a 100-mile-an-hour kind of a chap, and I accept, in the cycle of change, we're not all there. And, some people are pre-contemplative and others are ready to get going. So we've got to meet people where they're at. and then also be able to encourage people to do what's within their gift that allows them to change at the speed that suits them and to evolve in the speed that suits them. So it's going to be an ongoing process. But I think change will have to come, because the reality will be we're not going to shift the dials on things like inequalities unless we start to look more deeply, lifting the bonnet up and saying, well, what we have today is an outcome of a system that already exists. And if the system is not generating the outcomes we desire, and in fact the widgets are turning in the reverse direction, especially, for example, you look at women, working class women, their life expectancy is falling, then we must have to do something. We must have to reconfigure the system to achieve the outcomes that communities want and need. And what does that require of us? Well, it requires of us to listen and understand and collaborate across sectors and build systems that are inclusive and participatory. So I think the change will come, but I agree, not everybody can shift overnight. So it's just the gifts of head, hearts and hands that we can offer up at this time. And I see that every day. I see every day miracles, fantastic work within our public sector organisations, local authorities, NHS, of people who are walking the walk and offering up new connections, new ways of working, which I think bring me enormous hope. And we will get there. Maybe we're at the beginning of that journey, but we will arrive at a point of time where we will have an expanded consciousness and awareness of what is absolutely critical. But we've got to go on that journey, and that's why learning is so critical.
Mark, it's been absolutely wonderful speaking with you this morning. I could go on and on and on. I think that there's so much in what you say. And again, as you're talking about various things, I'm sure you're aware of the conversation about whose GDP. There's the profound nation of the things that are, the absolute sacred cows of this graph needs to be going up, but in a way that if it's disconnected from most people's money in their bank account or money on their swipey card when they need it, you're absolutely right. It's a restatement of the point of most of what government does, and that again, that should inspire all of us. I will put the links to some of the things that Mark's mentioned in the show notes, and I really encourage you to follow some of the possibilities that he has described for us. Thank you, Mark, for your time this morning.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.